President Trump is going after the people who he accuses of weaponizing the government against him. He has revoked the security clearances of Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Alvin Bragg, Letitia James, all of this coming days after he pulled the plug on Joe Biden's clearance, saying in a Truth Social post this: "There's no need for Joe Biden to continue receiving access to classified information. He set this precedent in 2021 when he instructed the intelligence community to stop the 45th president of the United States, me, from accessing details on national security, a courtesy provided to former presidents." In that same post, Trump also cited special counsel Robert Hur's report, which, you remember, that described Biden at the time as, quote, "an elderly man with a poor memory." Trump echoed that sentiment, arguing that Biden simply can't be trusted with classified information. All right, so a couple things to unpack here, guys. Joey, I actually want to start with you. Bit of a curveball here to mix a sports metaphor, but we watched that entire minute-long ad from the Secret Service.
Yeah.
You're someone who maybe saw an ad at some point in your life and were stirred to serve your country. That type of PR matters, trying to capture the imagination, the excitement, the passion, the commitment of young people. When you see that ad from the Secret Service, and they've been through the ringer recently for all sorts of reasons, we were talking about it last hour, what do you think of the ad?
Yeah, well, I saw a Marine slaying a dragon, and I thought, I don't even think that's legal anymore. They got to be protected. Little I know they were extinct. And then I found out that was a Marine officer, so I wouldn't have had that chance anyway. But no, I think it's great that I know what it's like to be the body, the guy in front of the more important person that hopefully takes the bullet, and that person doesn't, just in my time in the military. And I think it's a very powerful ad. They didn't shy away from JFK, which was obviously where they didn't get the job done that day. And so it really they showed the entire history of the Secret Service and where they've come from. And I think that was probably something that will inspire. We saw the numbers from DOD that have gone up in December and January under President Trump. You'd have to imagine other forms of law enforcement feel the same way. So, yeah, I think it's great that they put something out there that goes back to that moment I talked about earlier of you can be proud of your country and proud to serve it.
Molly, when we were reading through what President Trump said about Joe Biden revoking the security clearance, he just made it crystal clear this is retaliation. We didn't do this in the past. You made the choice to do this to me. So guess what? I'm in charge now. So I'm doing it right back to you. Is that turnabout, fair play, et cetera?
Well, I think from a practical point, it doesn't make too much of a difference. I don't think that he was going to be calling President Biden up for any advice, which is theoretically why former presidents would still have clearance so that they can stay up to date. And perhaps a later leader would look back and say, hey, you dealt with these kinds of issues, too. I need your insight. And I feel like that wouldn't be something President Trump would be doing anyway. As for these other revocations, it's a matter of trust. He doesn't trust these people and doesn't want them to have access to information. And here he is running a full government cleanse. So they think this is just, from his perception, perhaps part of what's going on. Joey made me think of something. This week, I covered a young Marine who was flown home by an organization that's expanding called Miles for Military, where people can donate, and the young members, soldiers, Marines, do volunteer hours, and in exchange, they get these flights home. And it made me think about how we're spending our money across America and how some of the money could be spent perhaps in giving these young Marines, young soldiers, a little more money in their pockets so that they could end up flying home and it wouldn't turn to some of the organizations that are forced to help get these young Marines home. So many more people are signing up right now. So it'd be great to be able to help out.
Charlie, there were a bunch of other former intelligence officials who also had some of their access restricted or denied by the Trump administration, going back to that letter that they signed about the Hunter Biden laptop. This is very much still a live issue in President Trump's mind, and I think in a lot of Americans' minds.
Well, yeah, they blatantly lied to manipulate an election. I can understand why Trump would not trust them or feel like they should have security clearance. I mean, when you've already proven yourself to be untrustworthy, why move forward in a direction where I say I'm going to give you access to some of the most important information in the country that could affect our path moving forward? I think actually Trump's being pretty chill, given all that has happened to him. All of these different types of people have tried to drag his reputation through the mud, tried to bankrupt him, imprison him. I mean, the fact that all he's saying is we're going to take away your security clearance and we'll just call it a day, go on with your lives, good luck. I think Trump's actually chill is the word I would put.
There's a little restraint in your mind from President Trump. Speaking of, let's turn to this story now. He is, with his administration, seeking to remake Washington in some important ways. And a lot of his opponents are not happy about it, some of them kind of losing it. And some of them, furthermore, are pulling a page out of their now very familiar old playbook. some of the far left media sounding the alarm about a constitutional crisis. We were talking about this earlier. Democrats, of course, following that lead.
We are at a point where we are basically on the cusp of a constitutional crisis.
We really do have a constitutional crisis.
What we are witnessing is a constitutional crisis.
This is the most serious constitutional crisis the country has faced.
No, it's not. But here's the thing. We've heard those cries before.
It could lead to a constitutional crisis.
We've talked for a long time about approaching a constitutional crisis. We are now in it.
At this point, we're beyond a constitutional crisis.
Yeah, so year after year, we have that phrase. And there is a boy who cried wolf effect sometimes where that is something. Look, there is such a thing as a constitutional crisis. I would argue that we may have had one with a effectively non-president for several years, with people around him running the country without maybe his full knowledge or consent. That's just my opinion. But constitutional crisis should be reserved for extremely serious things, Molly. And I think when you have this president's opponents employing that term over and over and over again, if at some point they need to go to that well, I think a lot of people are like, oh, we've heard it before.
Yeah, they will have heard it before. I think what President Trump is doing, because he's doing so many things so rapidly, is he is challenging the system to a certain extent. And we're going to see that in the courts in the coming days and in the coming weeks. We're going to see the pushback coming in the courts, particularly on the issue of citizenship, birthright citizenship. I think that one would be potentially something that actually applies to the Constitution, and there'll be a question and it'll go. But it's going to go through the normal process, the way our government is set up. There isn't anything radical happening here. It's all going according to how the government is set up. And if there's a problem with it, you can stand up and make changes. But right now, the Democrats just don't have the power to do that. They don't have the numbers in Congress to push back. So they're forced to push back in television interviews and in displays outside of the education.
And they're hoping that the mainstream media will then parrot their sentiments and try to blast that into the faces of Americans all over. But guess what? Americans have woken up. We now know not to trust the mainstream media. A lot more people, especially since the election. So I think that old strategy of theirs isn't going to work anymore.
That's a pretty safe bet that the media will carry the water for the Democrats, because they often do. But how effective is it? And the thing is, I was talking in the last hour when we mentioned the word crisis over and over. It's a very somber, very scary, weighty word. There seemed to be maybe a lack of conviction among some of them who were just spouting it. I'm not even clear exactly what they're referring to as the current huge constitutional crisis. What are they even talking about? Doge, the existence of Doge?
Yeah, I think that's their hair is on fire for Doge because it really threatens everything that is the swamp. I mean, that's really what you're taking a microscope to a mess, right? And you're looking inside the haystack for the needle now, and that bothers them because that's. So many of these politicians operate on that. We talk about pork that's put into legislation. It's this idea, hey, let me get a little bit of spending over here for this thing I want. So it happens in Congress all the time, and it happens in the executive branch even worse, because Congress loves to write a bill creating something and saying put all this money into it, but they don't like to take responsibility for how it's spent, so they don't mind to let the executive do that. And when the executive turns and says, you know what, we're willing to cut our own hand off to fix this, and by the essence of getting rid of federal workers, that really bothers them. It's hard to take them serious when they act like it's the worst thing that's ever happened. And just one last thing, they love to compare Trump to a lot of different people, the Hitler or Nixon or whatever. This idea that he's using the executive branch in a different way, President Lincoln did that too. And so probably more than any president ever had, completely changed what the executive branch was. And so the idea that everyone that's ever done this is a villain is not quite true.
Also to restrict and reduce the scope and role of government, right? You don't often see that from power-hungry autocrats. So it could be a partisan crisis for some. It could be a crisis for bureaucrats. That is a very different thing than a constitutional crisis. Mm-hmm. Well,
it requires faith to believe that living organisms, created male and female, crawled out of the water and then magically became land-dwelling animals, which then became humans.